It's 7 o'clock. I'd like to call the May 28th, 2019 Common Council meeting to order. Mr. Hampton, could you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I will, thank you.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Ms. Louise, could you do a roll call, please?
Mr. Boyce? Mr. Hampton?
Here.
Mr. Jensen?
Here.
Mr. Johnson?
Here.
Mr. O'Connor? Mr. Peterson?
Here.
Mr. Taylor? Ms. Wiles? Here. Mr. Ayers?
Present.
Mr. President, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Approval of the executive session memorandum, May 14th, 2019.
Motion to approve. Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, raise your hand. 6-0. I'm sorry, 5, 1 abstention. I've been blocked out.
What are you trying to say?
Approval of the minutes for the May 14th, 2019 meeting.
Motion to approve. Second.
Been moved and seconded. All those in favor, raise your hand. Motion carries 5 with 1 abstention. Approval of the agenda.
Motion to approve.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, raise your hand. 6-0. Petitions or comments by citizens who are present. I have none. If somebody would like to speak, there's a card that needs to be filled out right outside the door. If you fill that out and turn it into the clerk, then we will give you a chance to talk. Mayor's report to council. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, members of council. We have a guest today. Francisco Zeppi is from Italy. He is from Cittadella, our sister city. You've been here for a year, I believe.
Yeah, 10 months.
About 10 months. Attended his senior year here, and I think he's a little above that, but nonetheless, education-wise. But and actually stayed with a family just kind of down the street from me. But we're just happy to have him here. Want to wish him well and thank him for coming. I just, if you don't mind, I'll read this certificate of recognition. Presented to Francisco Zeppi. We call upon all citizens of the city of Noblesville to recognize Francisco for his participation in the Sister City Student Exchange Program. During his stay in Noblesville, he honored his home of Cittadella, Italy, and proved to be a talented and committed student. We'd like to thank you for your hard work, respect, and involvement while you were here. Noblesville was honored to have you. Presented this 28th day of May, 2019. So, thank you. You might remember there was an article in the Times, too, about him at the high school and his success as a student. So, thank you very much.
Mr. Mayor, quick question. Francisco, have you enjoyed your stay?
Yeah, I did.
Are you looking at moving back? College future? Or?
Probably, but I don't really know.
Don't know yet?
I still have 1 year of high school back there to finish.
Oh, okay.
Still haven't think about it.
All right. Great. Thank you.
Back to visit.
Sure.
Be safe.
Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead, Ms.
Been a little bit busy. We had a business visit with ID Casting Foundry. They're back, probably 50 employees or more. Really doing a great job. The Hamilton County Prayer Breakfast was held. I did go to the breakfast at the Brickyard for all the mayors. Good turnout. Had a ribbon cutting for Books and Brews. Pardon me. Young man is a Noblesville graduate, and he graduated in '90. So, and I don't have the name on the top of my head, but it's kind of fun to see a Noblesville person have that business out there. Public Works Palooza was held at Federal Hill Commons, had a chamber luncheon, and we also then, even this morning, had a business visit with Universal Blower. You might remember a few years ago, they expanded their production area. Coming up, we got the Darlington bed race on the 31st, which is Friday, ribbon cutting at Hamilton East Public Library. They had a tremendous flood, and so this ribbon cutting is kind of renewal after a pretty good-sized remodeling project. Street dance is Saturday night, the 1st. White River Vision Plan press conference will be held on the 3rd. We have a ribbon cutting at the Forest Park Carousel. Next week for council, well, for all, but is our Employee Appreciation Week. Starts on Monday and ends on Friday with a cookout at Forest Park, the shelter there. Lions Club's Pork Chop Dinner is coming up on that Friday, and we have another business visit to Ambassador Medical coming up on the 11th. So, again, keeping busy. Are there any questions of me? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Council committee reports.
Mr. President,
Wiles,
I have the Finance Committee report. We met last Thursday, and several items that are on our council agenda were discussed, so I'm not going to go into great detail since we'll have further conversation on those this evening. The claims do come to the council with the recommendation from the Finance Committee. Mr. Spalding stated that OpenGov is progressing well and that his primary focus is on this at this time and working with the different departments on the OpenGov budget builder. He's working on a number of other projects to help us move forward, and I'm going to just keep it brief because he will be up here shortly.
thank you, Ms. Wiles. Any questions? Approval of any other committee reports? Approval of claims?
So moved.
Been moved and seconded. All those in favor, raise your hand. Motion carries 6-0. Previously discussed ordinances. Once again, I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Hampton, and hopefully for the last time on this subject.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is ordinance number 20-05-19. Council to consider ordinance 20-05-19 and ordinance amending ordinance number 54-12-18 in connection with the city's pledge of local income tax revenues to the Noblesville Redevelopment Commission for the payment of lease rentals. Mr. Spalding.
Mr. Vice President and members of the council, Jeff Spalding, City Controller, and if you'll recall, this ordinance is on second reading, and at the last council meeting when it was introduced, we went through in a little bit more detail kind of the rationale behind what caused the ordinance to be brought forth and what's really happening, and just very, very quickly, the issue here is really kind of inside the financial markets, the way the rating agencies looked at certain ways that we put pledges on our ability to issue debt and issue additional debt relative to existing debt obligations, and there was some small aspect of the pledge structure that we had in place for debt to be backed by our local income tax that the folks at the Standard & Poor's rating agency raised some questions about, not really directed to us specifically, but all governmental entities, and suggested that we make a very slight adjustment in the way we defined that pledge structure in our bond ordinance. And what this action does is make that correction, and then what Standard & Poor's suggested is that our credit rating would benefit from making that choice, and we have gotten the credit rating, and we kept the AA+ rating on this type of debt that we'd had, and so the impact of this and pledging that we do it had the desired result with the rating agencies, and just closing it out will be the last thing, and we'll communicate to them that it has happened formally. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Spalding? Seeing none, we need a motion.
Mr. Vice President,
Ms. Wiles?
I would make a motion that we approve previously discussed ordinance number 20-05-19, the council to consider ordinance 20-05-19, and ordinance amending ordinance 54-12-18 in connection with the city's pledge of local income tax revenues to the city's Noblesville Redevelopment Commission for the payment of lease rentals.
I'll second that.
We have a motion and a second. This is a roll call vote. Ms. Lees?
Mr. Jensen?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Peterson?
Aye.
Ms. Wiles?
Aye.
Mr. Ayers is abstaining. Mr. Hampton?
Aye.
5 aye. The ordinance is adopted.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Ayer, back to you.
New ordinances for discussion. Council to consider ordinance 21-05-19, an ordinance concerning the adoption of the recreational zone improvement plan for 2019 to 2028, and amending ordinance 55-12-14, park impact fees.
Motion to introduce.
Second.
Ms. Yeldon and Mr. Bennett. And Mr. Howard.
You don't look
C,
like
none of the
either
above.
those.
Yeah, put your name on here, please.
Just as a point of introduction, for those of you who have not been involved in impact fee ordinances in the past, the city has had an impact fee for almost 30 years for both parks and roads. And it's my understanding that you all received a copy of these two documents. And it looks like a lot of busy work and a lot of numbers, but I'm going to take just a moment and explain to you that each and every one of these calculations is required in order to make an enforceable and defendable impact fee. The statute on impact fees was passed in 1991, and it set essentially what an impact fee does. It sets a fee on new development for the costs of certain infrastructure which is going to be caused, or the need for which will be caused by that new development. So in doing so, the fee must reflect the approximate cost of the infrastructure necessary to keep the city's level of service. And the city's level of service is extremely important because this is the calculation that justifies and makes our fee defensible. In this document, on page 25, there is a substantial explanation of a chart that lists the impact fee study for the city. And Chuck, you need to make the font just a little bigger for us older people. But essentially, the second column C is the level, or 1 and 2, they have the level of service for each of the approximately 35 different infrastructures. And that is how many units, whether it be baseball fields, acres of passive recreation ground, distance of trails, whatever the infrastructure identified, a unit per 1,000. From that unit per 1,000, it goes on in page 29 to then identify the actual costs of maintaining that level of service based on the 10-year projection growth of the population. Taking those numbers, the total cost of the infrastructure needed to maintain the same level of service when computed against the population growth, then gives you the impact fee that is justified under the study. We are extremely fortunate to have Chuck Lehman and Lehman doing this study. In the past, I've always recommended that we set the fee at about 90% of what's justified by the study, because I'm being a lawyer, I'm a little risk avoidance. I was afraid, maybe somebody will come in and tack our fee.
Well, this year I said, forget that 10% deduction because Chuck has done such an excellent job, and I don't see how anybody can make a more defensible calculation of the fees. So with that, and one little addition, because there is a mistake on page 6 of the ordinance, and it's my mistake, so I have to stand here and take a beating for it. But under section 4, the two-family unit per dwelling unit, that number should be $2,118. And so this ordinance is substantially similar to the ordinances we've had in place in the past. Obviously, the numbers have gone up due to inflationary costs, and I'm going to turn it over to Joyce Ann, because this plan must be made part of the comprehensive plan for the city, and she's going to report, give you an update on that.
Quick question, Mr. Howard, before you
Okay?
step. On your page 29, it references priority A, B, C, and D. Tell me what those mean.
Those are, I believe, and let me make sure I'm right, Bennett, the Parks Department kind of sets in priority what they would like to spend the money on first, but at the end of the 10-year period, you would expect the fee to fund that stuff. But obviously, one of the big issues we're going to be looking at is more passive recreational park ground. Well, you can't buy that in units of 1 acre, so sometimes you have to buy a little more, and then the other components of infrastructure have to catch up, but you can only spend the fee on the infrastructure identified in the plan. But
So A would encompass B, C, and D also? Is that,
on 29,
maybe
It's
I'm,
only calculated on the A categories, the A priority.
so B, C, and D would be an additional number to go on top of that to get to that level.
If we were going to use those in the impact fee calculation, which we have not. So only the A's, B, C's, and D's will be a part of our master plan.
But that is not going to be paid for out of the impact fees. Okay.
this, in this 5-year period, we may subsequently identify those as greater priorities in subsequent ordinances and have those paid for by fees.
Is this a 5-year period or?
5-year period, but to justify the fee, you look at a 10-year growth in population, then 5 years, you get to look back and do the adjustments that are necessary to make the fee meet the rough proportionality test.
Thank you.
Can I clarify something? Sorry. The fee that's being proposed is just for priority A, which has been identified with the columns on page 28 of this booklet as well. So it does not include anything else, just A. Got it. Thank you.
Sheldon?
Yes. I'm here to just basically report on the Plan Commission meeting, which was held last week. Last week, we did hear this introduction had a public hearing on the Recreation Zone Improvement Plan for 2019 through 2028. Again, as Mr. Howard has said, it is basically approximately every 5 years we go through and we update this plan. In order to update, again, the park impact fees, this Recreation Zone Improvement Plan must be updated and must be approved. The update to the plan, again, includes would update the current component inventory that we have, evaluate the previous plan. It also looks at population projections and building permit forecasts. It also establishes a community level of service. It does current and future infrastructure deficiencies, and it eventually determines costs for those current deficiencies and a future level of service. Again, the Plan Commission did hear this at the last Plan Commission meeting. They did determine that the plan is basically in compliance with the comprehensive master plan overall, and they sent it forward with a favorable recommendation by a unanimous vote of the Commission, and all 11 members were present.
Bennett?
Real quickly, we're going to bring Chuck up
Chuck Lehman with Lehman & Lehman has been our consultant doing impact fees with us since I've been here for 21 years, and before that, since impact fees came on board in Noblesville. So he has a very good understanding of how our community has grown, and I think one of the things to note is that we're doing these impact fees in conjunction with the road impact fees, and so the planning department was already gathering data for the housing and the population projections and those types of things. So we're using that same data to populate this, as you're going to see with the road impact fees, which was very helpful. Having these on the same 5-year plan has been beneficial to us. So I'm going to go ahead and bring Chuck up. He's going to walk you through, hopefully answer some of these questions that you may have on this impact fee, and then certainly we'll have time after for questions, and then we'll have a couple weeks if you have anything else that comes up. So we're going to turn it over to Chuck.
Very good. Thank you, Brandon. Good evening, Council. My name is Chuck Lehman. I'm president of Lehman & Lehman, a landscape architect and planner. As been shared, I've had the privilege of working with the city on this for many, many years. What I'm going to go through tonight is going through the smaller document, which is basically a PowerPoint presentation put to print. And I think that covers much of that, and I will go through this if you have questions as I'm going through, because there'll be a lot of numbers. This will be one of the few slides that actually has a picture on it. So as we go through that, if you have any questions, feel free to stop me and ask me. As you see on the front cover here, we are required to go through, we actually formed a park impact fee advisory committee, which will go on the next slide. But we then presented this to the Park Board on May 15th with the Plan Commission last week, tonight with the City Council, and then the second and final hearing in June 11th on that. The Recreation Impact Fee has to have a certain makeup that would include developers, real estate brokers, real estate people, and also builders. And you'll see the voting membership on the upper portion of that. I wanted to also thank the staff that actually were very much part of that, which is listed on the bottom of that. One of the things in the main document, the state requires that a professional engineer reviews the plan for compliance, and Jim Hellman from the city did that and was part of our team on that process. The impact fee formula, for those who haven't been through this before, impact fee itself is looked at the impact cost, which would be the cost of maintaining a level of service for that next 10-year period for the chosen infrastructure components. That number is reduced by any non-local revenues, which would be a donation of some sort, and then also impact deductions, which we'll get into as an example later on. You take that resulting number and divide that by the 10-year forecast of residential building permits, and that basically is how we arrive at the impact fee. The aspect of the level of service, somewhat of an illustration on this, you take a snapshot basically of today of what the city of Noblesville is population-wise, along with your current recreation infrastructure, your inventory of those components. You weight that against the recreation standards, which is that level of service itself. And in this illustration, we have more population than we have infrastructure, so that wedge of yellow would have to be funded outside of impact fees, and that's according to the state statute. In the future, and again, this would be that 10-year projection, you would be looking at more population, more new households, and possibly new infrastructure of recreation components. You weight that against that same recreation standard, that level of service, and in this case, that green wedge can be completely funded by impact fees. So that typically helps understand the difference between a current deficiency and a future need. Part of this process, we went through and looked at the historical significance of residential building permits over the last several years. This goes back to 1996. Looking at that growth within that time period, you'll see in 2007 and the subsequent years after that, there was the downfall, which was basically a national issue of that economic downturn. But you can see in the past several years, it has been increasing. The chart up above actually illustrates the type of housing unit. The one down on the bottom actually recognizes that same total, but also includes a trend line as well. In working with the city, again, we define our level or impact fee zone as being that of the planning jurisdiction of the city itself, so we're not creating any new boundaries within the city limits. And we also look at your future land use plan to project where that growth area and where they would occur. As was mentioned before, this year we were able to take advantage of some joint effort of the road impact fee, which also has to look at population increases and forecast, and we were able to actually couple that with our information in this study. The next several pages actually documents more of that road impact fee data population. The third column from the right, that tan column, would represent where the 10-year dwelling units of residential units would be forecasted. This goes through to that very bottom number there. You'll see that there is a forecast of 7,404 dwelling units or building permits in that next 10-year period. That would represent about a 60% build-out of the parcels of land that was looked at. There were several parcels of land of existing developments that also we wanted to acknowledge that the impact fee and the road impact fee population forecast did not capture, and those are documented here. All of those are represented 100% build out in the next 10-year period, so that's an additional 785 dwelling units. The summary on that, on the upper portion, if you add those two elements together, it would represent a 10-year growth forecast of almost 8,200 dwelling units, which would represent a population based on the 2010 census. Persons per household would represent about a 22,000 population growth in that next 10-year period. This would represent, if you take that simple number and divide it by 10, the number of building permits is 819. The average for the last 5 years has been 828. So basically, this is somewhat of a conservative effort on that, but it's very much in line with what the city has been experiencing. The bottom chart, we do this just for build-out capacity. You know, if the existing population 2018 is 61,882. If everything was built out according to the forecast that we had just gone through with the road impact fee, the future growth potential would be over 100,000 people. What we're looking at for the next 10 years would be an additional 22,000, as I mentioned before, or population at 2028 as being 83,911. We take that number and actually forecast that over that time period of the next 10 years. So the blue charts or blue bars in the bottom would represent the historical population growth, and then the red charts or red tables would represent that 10-year growth projection. So you'll see that we start off somewhat what you're using right now is about 552 dwelling units per year, and that would grow up to 2028 to be over 1,200 building permits. But again, that's how we forecast that growth. We acknowledge the park infrastructure itself. The park acreage was noted. We had also, there are some open space acreage that are made up of trails that are not designated as a park, like the Midland Trace Trail, the Levee Trail, and the Stony Creek Trail. We acknowledge that those do carry acreage on that, so those have been factored in too. But you'll see on this chart that there's a total acreage of park recreation land of 876 acres. We get into that 35 plus category of infrastructure, and if you
want to go through an eye test, you try to look from you try to look at that from this standpoint, and you can't see too many clarity. But what this does is we look at all 30, I think there's 36 different recreational components on that. The green shaded bars would represent those components found within the park system itself. The tan would represent what the schools make up, and then the blue on the very far right-hand side would represent what other recreation providers are providing as far as infrastructure on that. That information then is broken down in greater detail. So this, we're just looking at the land itself. So as I said before, our total acreage is 876. With your current population, there's been different standards as far as what has been set up for park type, as that'd be from a block park all the way up to a community-sized park or a special park. Well, for the sake of uniformity, we just basically look at one acreage amount, and that's found in that bottom portion of this table. So how you would read that is that if you look at the current level of service, actually a box in between, the current level of service of that 876 is serving the current population to be 13.84 acres per 1,000 people. That's what your snapshot of today is providing. What we met with the advisory committee and working with the park staff, we established the community level service need as being 13.64 or 60 acres per 1,000. So you'll see in the bottom table there on column M, there would be a current surplus of almost 15 acres of land, and then that future need with that current future population of an additional 265 acres of land in the future. Because there's no current deficiency, there's no deficiency, and then in the future that 264 could be funded completely by impact fee dollars. For the sake of comparison, we do collect data from other communities and what their standards are. It's not to say that any one community should be like someone else, because each community is unique, but for sake of comparison, we've documented this, and this is part of our study as well. As Mr. Howard had outlined, this is really getting into the details of that, but you'll see what in column B in this case is what is the community level service standard for the city of Noblesville. So I'll look at the very first yellow line through there. The yellow lines are basically the A priorities that were established by the park department as well as the advisory committee. The multipurpose fields, there's a standard of 1 acre or one field for every 5,000 people. Currently, there are 3 in column E. You'll see that there's 3 fields found within the park system. In the future, you'll see, or currently, to match that level of service, we need in column I, you would need 9.67 fields. So there's a current deficiency in column, basically that's what the current deficiency is. In the future, there'd be a need for an additional 4.11 fields for that. That's basically how that is factored all the way down through that column through there. I should mention, and maybe this would be a good point to mention it too, the A priorities, the ABC priorities on here are not necessarily those that are felt to be the priorities of the community. But in using impact fees, there's some priorities. For example, if you don't have an aquatics facility, for example, and you say you want to set that up as a level of service, well, if you don't have anything right now, no matter what your level of service standard would be, you would have a deficiency. So some of these things are really wagered or leveraged towards what is the usage of the impact fees as a leverage for the best use of funding on that. This slide basically looks at those various costs, and we would take into account anything that had been bid recently and apply that to the unit cost. But you'll see then in that column where those things follow, I think the next slide actually the next one after this. But you'll see each of those line items carries an impact fee potential. That multi-purpose field that we used as an example before, with the impact fee future, there would be an impact fee dollar amount of $45 on that. If everything was calculated and used as part of that impact fee, that very bottom line would indicate that there would be an impact fee of $3,603. So what we're looking at basically are the 8 priorities. So this is the listing of those. Everything that we have listed here, with the exception of a pickleball court, which is the second line item down, has been used before as far as previous priorities for the impact fee. And we basically kept those with the addition of the pickleball court, was a new one added this year. You'll see that total in that third column from the right gives a summary of $2,119, which would be the combination of all those various components up above that. It's also important to note, we always include those last 2 columns, the ratio between the city share and that of the impact fee share. You'll see in the multi-purpose fields, we have more of a current deficiency than we have a future need. So you'll see, in order to get the impact fee of 30 cents, you're going to have to pay 70 cents to do that. But in combination, those last 3 on that, the maintenance facilities and multi-use pathways and trails and park open space acres, you have no current deficiency. So basically, everything that you would apply for that future need would be to the city's benefit. As I said before, we need to look at all those various components, where that current deficiencies, where that funding is going to come from. Because there is a current budget or a current fund established for impact fees right now, we acknowledge those as being part of that cash. So the second column from the right, that cash column, the majority of the current deficiencies will be funded out of that cash because they were collected for those same deficiencies and the same infrastructure components in previous studies. There's 3 different areas that could be receiving grants, and we acknowledge those on that center portion there. And then there's one item underneath the park capital improvement budget that was for the pickleball courts. That was something that was unique in comparison, and I'll explain that in the next slides. Impact fees statute states that any current deficiencies are exempt from the new people coming into town. So those people are exempt from having to pay for current deficiencies. So we are acknowledging that those, basically those current deficiencies will have to be discounted, and that's where the term impact deductions come into play. So that $94,000 would be factored in as coming out of the park capital improvement, along with that line item, total line item, would be funded by grants and that park capital improvement. So that park capital improvement will be funded in the year 2020, and we would acknowledge how many new residential homes would be developed in that time period, and that would represent the value for each of those homes in the system would be in $3.90 at that point in time. And you take that number, $3.90 times that 1,141 new households, that would indicate an impact deduction of $4,447. So that number is actually factored into the final calculation. So recall the previous number was $2,119. When you apply that deduction of $4,447, it reduces the impact fee by $1 down to $2,118. As has been done in the past, there is a housing equivalent that has been part of your past ordinances. Those are based on a percentage of the full equivalent, looking at a single-family dwelling as being that full equivalent. And then anything less than that, like a two-family dwelling, would represent 95% of that. So that impact fee would be $2,012 and so on. We had also a recommendation by the Park Board, and what was presented to the Plan Commission was to apply an impact adjustment on an annual basis based on the inflation factor of what the cost of construction is over that period of time. The Indianapolis MPO has what they refer to as their gross domestic product index. It's a table and chart on this that actually illustrates that over the last 15-year period, that average increase has been around 4%. What recommendation was to look at a 3% increase on an annual basis of an impact fee. So in the table up above, you'll see that center portion would start off at $2,118. in 2023, that would increase to $2,384, and if that ordinance would continue, it would be $2,764. This seems to be a very efficient way of actually maintaining what the cost of those goods and services and construction is. The last couple of slides were required by the state statute also to develop a schedule as far as how those current deficiencies will be funded, not only in what year, but what location and in what various parks within that framework. So this plan, basically this chart kind of illustrates that. We do the same thing for the future needs, which would be the impact-related improvements. And again, those would have to be developed based on what that growth speculation of what revenues would be brought in. So this is strung out over that 10-year period. The last slide is basically the recommendation is to follow the one impact fee zone, looking at applying the A priorities through that. The current deficiencies would be fulfilled within that 10-year period of that $22.7 million. The future needs with the impact deductions of that $17.3 million would be funded through impact fees with an impact fee of $2,118. It is recommended to continue the housing equivalent, and also the recommendation to add the annual inflation factor on an annual basis. The reporting the revenue and expenditures will be done in the past with the City Parks Department, including that as part of their annual report. A lot of numbers and one more picture of a picture rather than numbers. Any questions that you may have at this point?
Questions? Mr. Peterson.
Thank you. This is the second time I've had the chance to hear this presentation, so I came with questions. I didn't get all this out of this meeting. The first question, it's a personal question. If you have a two-bedroom home and you convert it to a three-bedroom home, do you go back and pay impact fees, or
no?
If you convert your garage to an apartment?
Unless that would be, typically there's nothing tied to the square footage or even the number of bedrooms. Part of the discussion of the housing equivalent, if you have a single-family home, that was considered to be more than one bedroom. If you have a one-bedroom apartment, you're probably going to have less people occupying that, which would be less users of the infrastructure of recreation.
This is mostly geared to new development.
It's only new developments,
right.
Yeah.
So if I convert an old, okay.
Right.
That's a personal question, so
yep.
Joyce Hand's not paying attention, I hope, to that question. But the other question I have is a regional impact. For example, are we able to take advantage of or consider a reservoir that's not necessarily here, and how that affects our water recreation and things like that? And including, and Hamilton County Parks has a significant amount of property. Are we taking advantage of that in the study?
We didn't have anything with water recreation as part of our infrastructure that we tabulated at this point.
We currently don't, because we don't really have access to it. The only way it would impact us is if there's development around that, and we were able to pull impact fees from that development. Those impact fees are paid at the time that the building permit is pulled.
Okay.
On that point, Mr. Pierce, you really wouldn't want that, because then you'd have to adopt the level of service you have for water recreation, then you get to build a new reservoir down the road.
Right.
So, and there's no way to do that in small increments. So that's kind of the idea of why you don't add new stuff. We had a former parks director that always put in a community center in there. Well, it was an immediate deficiency, which becomes an unfunded mandate to you by adopting the plan.
Or if we see Hamilton County come through and gobble up some parks, we can then go back and readjust this based on open space.
Yeah, you can. And, and again, the ironic thing on this, you do a 10-year projection, but in year 4, you start this process over again.
So then one other thing we mentioned at the Planning Commission was the rate we had 4 years ago when we did this. We took out an automatic escalator of 3%, which would put us close to this number we have currently. So that
it's not quite, but it's almost
bared itself out.
Yep.
Okay.
The current fee is $1,718. We recommended the 3% increase, and the last impact fee did not go in the ordinance, so therefore we did not collect that 3% escalator. Had we collected it, it would be close to, and I think it's in here, but it's somewhere around $1,950 currently, so we're only $150 above what that would be.
And then last week, some of us had a discussion with the golf consultants as we start to convert, as we saw with racquetball clubs fell off, and then they turn into aerobics, and then they turn into whatever they are now, yoga. I haven't been in any of them. So how does that, as we start to look at golf, and I saw in here disc golf and foot golf were a B and golf was a D, how does that sort of, as we continue this golf discussion, how does that factor in?
That will come into effect when we update the 5-year master plan. As I said before, this is not necessarily reflective of the priorities of the overall master plan of the city department. This is more the priorities of using impact fees as a funding source.
And one of the things that we've looked at is where do we think we're going in the next 5 years? What amenities do we think are going to be required? And we've tried to look at the amenities that the public is, your traditional park amenities, playgrounds, shelters, spray ground, ball fields, those types of things. It's more for building new capital, not necessarily transitioning something or maintaining something.
And just in all fairness to the question that came up you presented, our two neighboring communities, their park impact fees are completely out of whack and not really usable, but I just think it'd be important to just hear what those are.
On page 37 of the main document, you'll have a collection of what we have on that, but
None of them were in Hamilton County though, were they?
Yeah, they were.
Yeah.
Okay.
The Carmel's impact fee right now is $29.81. Fisher's is
$1,200 or so.
$10.70. Westfield is $11.44. The average of the ones we have listed there is about $12.78. There is on that same page is a national firm that looks and studies impacts throughout the country. The national average of 195 municipalities is 2812.
Any other questions, Mr. Peterson?
I think that's it.
Mr. Hampton?
I said one, it's not really a question, it's more of a thought. And they all say, oh no, not will, with a thought. But a lot of what we're hearing from the housing study and from the schools is that while we are going to grow as a community, a lot of the community will not have children and it'll be, not the family with 2 kids and 3 kids or whatever. How much was that taken into this study that demographic is likely, based on other reports that we're hearing as council, how does that change or should that change what this is?
We hadn't looked at that in detail in some of the other communities where they were actually having a housing developer coming in and building smaller footprint homes. By that I mean around 800, 900, maybe even 1,100 square feet. They decided to go with a housing equivalent on that was not based on square footage, but maybe a different classification on that. I would say that this would be something that the city ought to study and continue to monitor over the period of time. As we come back and visit this in 4 more years, if we need to make an adjustment, I think that would be the time to do it. Or if there's even a need to do it beforehand, that'd be a time to look at it as well.
I think the other side to that is that a lot of these amenities that we're looking at and we're talking about as our A priorities are amenities that the general population is going to use. Maybe not the playground, but there's still going to be kids that are coming in, maybe not as many, but we're seeing so many older generational types of facility needs out there now as the population continues to age, such as trails and open space and pickleball and all those different shelter rentals and all those things. We're seeing those things, which is really kind of what this is geared towards. So it really will hit even that demographic that may not be having, there may be more empty nesters. They're still going to need the facilities and utilize the facilities.
Any other questions, Mr. Hampton? Questions? I have a few of them, naturally. So the current study says that the impact fee should be $36.03 if we included every scenario.
All the A, B, and C priorities, right?
And so right now we're only looking at what this will fund will be those priority in A. How do we not end up in a deficit 4 years from now or 10 years from now, much like we're in the deficit today?
You mean with deficiencies?
Deficiency, yes.
Go ahead, Mike.
What happens is you reduce the level of service or the proportions for that infrastructure. For example, if you decide we're not going to build a golf course and there is X amount of acres of golf course per thousand, in the subsequent, you can adjust what your level of service is and what your proportion is to, instead of X acres per thousand, X minus 10 acres per thousand. So what you do is you say, we don't, kind of to Mr. Peterson's question, we don't see the demand for that type of infrastructure anymore, so we're going to reduce it. But we look at the priorities of the infrastructure that we believe is going to be demanded by the growth, and then you back down the other. So it just becomes a proportionate relationship.
I understand, but we have teams that are fighting for ball fields, and that's not on your priority list.
Correct.
And so, I'm trying to think, well, I'd like for new development to pay for future use. And if we're not going to be able to provide those level of services to get us there, then we have to look at other ways to fund them. I don't think any of us wants to cut services.
Right.
I mean, we want to be a premier community. So anyway, that's just a quick food of thought.
Sure.
Secondly, as I sit here quite often, almost every meeting, get compared to the communities to our south and to our west. I notice your community level of service doesn't take into account any of those three communities. I'd be curious what your open space per acre per thousand is for those communities. And you don't have to give me that right off the top of your head if you want to email it or let me know.
Yeah. Going back to your first point about if you go to page 21 on the smaller version, that table,
Right.
part of we could go with impact fee, actually go to page 22, it actually illustrates it better. If you decided to go with an impact fee of everything on that list, you'd have an impact fee of $3,600. That would fund a future need of $29 million, but it also would commit the city to fund the current deficiencies, which is over $30 million. So some of that is kind of what you have, what you don't have, why we're not going with all the A, B, and C priorities.
I know we're carrying deficiencies now, and we need to try to fulfill those. It's nice that the schools have helped us out a lot, but I don't, they're fighting for ground too, so.
Absolutely. I'll get you those levels of service to our surrounding communities. Most of these were pulled because they are communities that
I've worked on.
Chuck has worked on and has access to those, but we'll be happy to pull those and get them out to
But I always
everyone.
get these other three thrown at me every time.
Absolutely.
And you do too, so.
Yep.
And then the other question I have is on the big book.
Yep.
Page 36, donations in lieu of impact fee components. And my concern is, I don't know exactly what we're saying there, but my thought is the developers have to have the green space anyway. So their natural clause is say, well, we want impact fee credit for this green space, but it's owned by a homeowner association, so my family can't go and enjoy that green space, so it's not park ground.
Right.
And I don't, we're giving an impact fee, so we're taking that money out of your use for future needs that we have and putting it into a homeowner association, which should be part of what they do anyway, in my mind.
Mr. Mayor, one of the major changes I worked on is in Section 5. First of all, the state statute says...
Where are you at, Mike?
Section 5 of the ordinance.
On the back page?
Page 7. Statute says that if a developer dedicates... Of the ordinance.
I don't even know if I have the ordinance here.
Did they make the packet? Did they get emailed out?
I did not get that.
Friday?
The ordinance is not in us.
Okay, they were emailed out.
Yeah, I didn't print.
Well,
Go ahead.
let me explain a little bit. The statute requires that if a developer dedicates infrastructure which can be used, then they should get a credit for it. And our previous statute said shall, and I amended this to say that the fee payer may request credits toward the fees imposed by this ordinance, and the request may be approved by the city if, one, the infrastructure constructed is either dedicated to the city or owned or operated by a neighborhood association, if the infrastructure is described and defined in the zone plan. Two, the infrastructure is permitted to be used by all citizens of the city. Three, the infrastructure is reasonably accessible and usable by the citizens of the city, considering the location, size, and condition of the infrastructure. So that section was added because if somebody, we haven't had problems with this, but somebody comes in and says, I got a acre of woods over here that I can't use, I'm going to dedicate that city the infrastructure. Well, the previous ordinance says shall. We shall accept it and give credit in lieu of that. And this gives us some discretion to use those three criteria in determining if this infrastructure really is the type of stuff that benefits all the citizens and is of such a type that it's usable. So we changed that particular issue. We still comply by the state statute, but we did raise the bar that it must meet our standards before we accept it and give credits.
I appreciate that. It wasn't in the packet, and it's buried in the 3,000 other
I was in
emails.
depositions 2 days last week and didn't get it to the clerk's office till 4/26, I think, Friday. So
Thank you. I appreciate the effort. That's something Mr. Johnson.
Quick question, Brandon. What Brian said about ballparks and things like that we don't have enough of, and, is the thought process about not adding a great deal of those things, is the thought process that some of that need will be met by private entities?
Yeah, that's part of it. That's a big part of it, actually. The other part to it is, how much of when you start talking about baseball and softball, how much of that are we getting into the business of running those youth sports activities? Yeah. And we're seeing the trend change a little bit with how youth sports are going. Certainly, I think it's something we need to look at is what's the onus on the city versus the onus on private development that's coming in. And we know that there's conversations out there about potentially providing some of these services in the community so that we necessarily don't have to do it. And that's one of the reasons we didn't include those.
Well, and then you also have the unknown, who'd have thought 10 years ago that pickleball would have even been in our thought process.
And it's
what's the next one?
Out of control.
What's the next one?
Right. And so we can pick and choose from many of these, but we really tried to also be cognizant of, what is it going to do from a current deficiency standpoint as well. And that number can really creep up there really quick. And I know that at that point in time, then I'm coming back and saying, look, we need to fund these outside of impact fees. And I understand the will is not always there to do those things, so we're trying to be conservative from that perspective as well.
Mr. Jensen, you have a question?
No. Trying to direct traffic for you.
Appreciate that. Any other questions?
Mr. President, to correct my error, I would suggest a motion to include the two-family dwelling unit on page 6 to be increased to $2,118. Need to amend the ordinance to have that amendment.
Can we amend that in 2 weeks before we vote, or should we do it?
You'll have it in there next time.
Yeah.
And it'll be in the document.
So say the number again. Say the number again.
$2,118 per
For the two-family dwelling.
for the two-family dwelling.
So Mr. President, I would make a motion that we amend ordinance number 21-05-19, section 4, that the two-family dwelling unit be charged a fee of $2,118.
Second.
Vote on this amendment.
Yes. Hand vote.
Hand vote. Been moved and seconded to amend the ordinance. All those in favor, raise your hand. 6-0. Be prepared, there's 3 members on here that'll probably ask the same questions of you in 2 weeks that we just asked.
Well, I want to congratulate you because you now know more than 99.99% of the population about impact fees. And thanks to Chuck for all his work.
We look forward to the road impact fee presentation.
Thank you very much, and if you have questions over the next 2 weeks, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we'll be happy to entertain any of those you have, and I'll get that information that you requested, Mr. Air, out to everybody later this week.
All right, appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Moving on, council consider ordinance 22-05-19, an ordinance approving additional appropriations from the Motor Vehicle Highway MVH Fund for right-of-way acquisition costs and establishing a public hearing. Mr. Spaulding.
Motion to introduce.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Mr. Spaulding.
Mr. President, members of the council, this ordinance is fairly straightforward, and the whereas clauses kind of lay out the rationale. Essentially, as everybody here is aware of, we are in the throes of looking at future improvements along Pleasant Street. That process often requires the purchase of some land in that corridor as right-of-way. There's a fairly defined process the council has to go through for that, but at the recommendation of the Finance Committee and with the support of the mayor, the thought was to at least have funds appropriated and available as those properties do get identified, for council consideration. So that's what this ordinance does. Worked with the engineering department to at least get a sense based on the planned work that would be upcoming in the relatively near future, and what at least a sense of scope on the cost of property acquisition might be in 2019 to come up with this amount of $1.25 million for appropriating now. And so that's the purpose of the ordinance, is to just have those funds appropriated for the remainder of 2019 for potential right-of-way acquisition. Any questions? I'm happy to take.
Any questions of Mr. Spaulding?
Mr. President,
Mr. Hampton.
I make a motion to set a public hearing for this on June 11th.
Second.
Been moved and seconded to establish the public hearing on June the 11th. All those in favor, raise your hand. See you in 2 weeks. Thank you, sir. Council comments. The mayor hit on this. I'm going to hit on it again. It's a busy weekend in Noblesville, Indiana. Darlington bed races Friday night, and the street dance on Saturday, late afternoon, evening. So a lot of good events, free events to come to in downtown Noblesville. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. We're adjourned. Thank you.